The attack on Pearl Harbor threw America into World War II. Germany was creeping its way across Europe while Japan was on the water to the east. Young men enlisted and left their homes behind to help push back the Germans and the Japanese. Everything changed in America, from manufacturing down to conserving food. The home front became open territory for job opportunity and economic experimentation as business converted to war production and women moved into those positions. The impact of the war changed America for the better by bringing communities and organizations together for a common purpose. Bernice Lehman recounts her time on the home front and her husband's time serving in the military.
Well, we live in Fairhaven, a community where we all know each other real well, but when we lived on Pinecrest, we knew our neighbors a little bit, but it just isn't the same as it was then. We would visit back and forth. My mother would have them over for coffee, and just very hospitable, and people just aren't that way. But we used to play together a lot, the communities. The kids played out in the street, and it was different. And there wasn't any bullying that I remember at all. But it was different. I wish it could be more like that today. It so happened that we lived in Rockford, and I went to East High School. I graduated from there in '47. My younger siblings were in grade school. And during that time, there was a polio epidemic, if you remember reading or hearing about that. And my mother took my 3 younger siblings and went to Minnesota and lived with my grandmother and other relatives during the polio epidemic.
During the last stretch of the war, a deadly virus called poliomyelitis plagued many urban cities and towns throughout the United States. Rockford was impacted heavily by polio and was dubbed the Summer of Fear by the Rockford Register-Star newspaper in 1995. At this time, polio was called infantile paralysis, which, given by its name, usually infects small children. However, adults can contract this disease, such as influential characters like President Roosevelt. In July 1945, Rockford saw over 200 cases, which then became a community emergency the same day Allied troops declared victory over Japan. The virus infects commonly through saliva and generally shows flu-like symptoms. A very low percentage may experience muscle weakness, usually in the legs, right away. However, people may develop those symptoms later down the road. Many children died or suffered permanent crippling because of it. In Winnebago County alone, 382 diagnosed, 32 of them died, and 80% of them were children. Polio impacted the community in Rockford by forcing families to move for shelter.
And it was several months. They stayed up there, and so they didn't, my mother didn't feel all the effects of the war, but several months she did when she lived at home. But the day that the war ended, my father, and I don't seem to have the letter right here, my father wrote my mother a letter, and it's dated August 15th. The war ended August 14th. And so he wrote to her. That's why I have a letter to tell her exactly what happened in town the night the war ended, which I remember very well.
Would you mind reading us that letter?
He said, well, the war is over, as you no doubt know, but did Rockford ever know it? First of all, infantile paralysis, polio, is still going. There was a new case, and he goes on about the polio epidemic. They must have heard about the war ending, because my father says here that they were in the bosses were called into the plant, into a meeting, and nothing was said to the people who worked there. And every day from then on, we have just been waiting to hear some news. And last night, which would have been the night the war ended, last night, a few minutes after I got home, the long-awaited news came. So I went downtown and talked about people, and it was something. It was about 7 o'clock, he said, when the people and the car and people started going downtown on that. So it wasn't early in the morning when they found out. It was almost the same thing all the time, just running up and down the streets, and on especially West State Street, the first block of West State Street. I can remember so well. And they're drinking. There was no drinking. I think my father in the letter, and I could not, of course the letter's gone, I could not find it real quickly, but he said there had, of all that celebrating, there were only 5 arrests in the city of Rockford. No drunkenness. And that amazed me. And of course I would have been way too young anyway. Yeah. I don't think that anything special except just happy, 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 and hugging and kissing and just thanking our soldiers. And this is written August 15th. The war ended August 14th at night, around 7 o'clock our time. Well, that's when he heard about it. And I suppose we did too. I don't remember what prompted us to go downtown, but I know that, I mean, that's what happened. I don't remember hearing, the war is over, let's go downtown. Right. I'm sure I did. At night, we would have planned blackouts. You could not even have a radio on if it showed absolutely not the tiniest bit of light. And then there would be guards that would walk up and down the street to check. But every once in a while they would say, such and such a time where there will be a blackout, no lights.
All day I had acted as a medic, wearing a band just like the rest. I had done this all day until I learned where my company was. I went up to the company in a jeep. I cannot tell any more now except that my platoon leader, Lieutenant Cordes, was one of the casualties I had to carry back to the medics. He had lost his left leg.
Buchenwald concentration camp was established in 1937 near Weimar, Germany. It was one of the largest camps that has been established on German soil, and over the course of 7 years, Buchenwald has housed over 230,000 prisoners. For the most part, concentration camps held Jewish prisoners. However, the camps were known to contain a variety of other races, non-heterosexuals, and members of organizations that opposed the Germans. Although it was illegal to detain prisoners of war in these camps, there have been instances that POWs have been detained there. Following the liberation of Buchenwald in 1945, the Soviets took control of it and used it as an internment camp. Today, what remains of Buchenwald is now a memorial, a museum to honor those who have died or survived the horrors that took place.
He graduated in 44. It was 44 that he got shipped out. When they came to the Buchenwald camp, the Germans heard that the Americans were coming, so they opened the gates and let the prisoners out. So they started running, a lot of them, 4 boxcars that were on the railroad side of the street. And they started running for that, and as they ran, the German soldiers shot them all dead. And he said, you'll never forget, there are three things: the sight of that, the smell of the blood, and just the horror. And he's written that in one of talks that he gave at Memorial Day at a cemetery, and that you'll never forget the sight and the feeling. How can anyone be so horrible to do those horrible things? He was the first one in there.
Wow.
That, and took those pictures and shot and got these things, all these souvenirs off from the German soldiers that were dead. The only thing that bothered him was talking about it. And in one newspaper article that they had about him, he's been in the news a lot, the last sentence he said was, "I will never talk about this again. Brings back too many memories." I thought, yes, he will. That's when I made the appointments for us to go. And I said, I'll go with you. I'll help you. I'll talk the whole home front, and you do the war. Of course, he did most of the talking. I went away to college and worked my whole way through. So I had a job there. I worked in the dining hall. And I think my mother continued working too. I really don't recall. But I've never had a problem getting a job. I don't know what it would be like right today, but I've always been able to get a job. And living in Japan, well, I lived in the Philippines 1 year, in Japan 3 years. Oh, the Japanese people are wonderful, just wonderful.
I deem this reply a full acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration, which specifies the unconditional surrender of Japan. In the reply, there is no qualification. Arrangements are now being made for the formal signing of the surrender terms at the earliest possible moment.
The atomic bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki created an end for the greater part of World War II. Japan surrendered September 2nd, 1945, following after those two nuclear explosions. Japan's motives in joining the Axis power extended from their desire to prevent what happened to 19th century China to themselves. Much like Western powers, Japan sought to gain more power by invading Manchuria and increase its influence towards mainland China, or face the same fate China had with the United States. Japan simply imitated Western imperialism by adopting a new government and threw away past isolationist policies. It is clear that Japan had the very same ambitions as the United States and did not want to be a mere stepping stone for the Western world by asserting its dominance throughout the East.
I had one of the girls that was in my class, her grandmother remembered the war. I said, ask your grandmother some questions. And she wrote down some things that her grandmother had remembered. I said, you talk to your grandmother and ask her all the questions you can. In fact, any of you students, that's history. And they love Americans over there. And Japan. If you want to talk about difference in culture and country, they are so honest. They are so honest. I can't believe, well, that's a different story. But when we were in Japan, we taught English as the second language. And one of my husband's students his father was the head of the Air Force. And his father was the one that said, bomb Pearl Harbor.
Really?
And he said, my father was a good man. He just didn't know what he was doing. And I think that's probably true. I mean, under that type of leadership. And like Hitler, you did what he said. Oh, just that we say that will never happen in the United States. I don't know. I hope not.
The Harlem Veteran Project has done a lot for me and has honestly changed me as a person. For the first few weeks, I can't honestly tell you how many times I have watched Bernice's documentary. What I took away most from was rewatching every video over and over again to learn that history is more important than looking at a textbook and memorizing some lines regarding what happened in the past. History is important to look back on and understand the failures and the successes of our predecessors. What I've taken most from this experience is that I want to impact people's lives and change the way they look at history. Although my future career path may not be as direct as some might think, I still believe that my passion will allow me to share those beliefs and help touch those who had never had those opportunities that I have had. It is unfortunate that Bernice will never see her finished documentary. Thank you to all those involved in making this happen.